Hello and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. Today, let's talk about Elton John. He might as well be one of the best musicians, singers and artists alone that England has to offer, with great memorable songs such as Rocket Man, Crocodile Rock, Tiny Dancer, and of course, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, just to name a few. And those were just from the early 70s era. However, there was a time, particularly around the mid to late 70s and even a bit into the early 80s, where a lot of his albums, despite being released on a frequent basis, somewhat, they weren't really topping the big charts as one would have liked or think. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of his albums are still just as good as his more famous classic ones, in particular Blue Moves, which no doubt I'll be looking into later down this year. But for that time, they weren't really topping up much singles as his more familiar albums. However, today I'm going to be taking a look at one of those albums, and one that at the time of this video has turned 40 years old. And that is an album simply known as The Fox. Now, as you can see, the cover is very minimalist, much like a lot of Elton's albums of this era. It's basically just a shot of a very abstract looking room with simple chair, table, of course the titular grey fox here, and presumably a little TV with Elton's face on it, as well as shot on the back. I don't know about you, but I can imagine living in a room like this, especially if I lived in the 1980s myself. So yeah, it's very standard, and it's still a very consistently done cover. So yeah, with that analysis out of the way, let's talk about the music itself. Beginning with Breaking Down Barriers, a classic piano poppy track that's very reminiscent of Elton John's heyday. Very much like Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting, and something of a precursor to I'm Still Standing, maybe. Its lyrics seem to go about how Elton has kind of sheltered himself off from most other people, like build a wall around his height, and restrain from close personal romantic relationships. And now he meets this other person. He takes this opportunity to kind of break down the barriers that he himself have built, and to confront this potential relationship. And in a way, it could also be kind of a subtle allegory for his, shall we say, homosexuality, which I'll get into more a bit later with Elton's Song. But for now, it's not explicitly about gay relationship. It can be about heterosexual one, but given context, it is still very subtle and ambiguous. And in a way, the concept of breaking down barriers could also reference how a lot of media can just pigeonhole any artist or singer into just a particular style or genre. And here's Elton saying that I can break down the barriers of music and styles. I can do different things. I can do different songs and different moods and different styles. And it is kind of ironic, since a song like this does sound like a song you would expect to hear from Elton John. Next is Heart in the Right Place, a more groovier, funkier track about what seems to be an unstable rivalry and revenge and all that, accompanied by what seem to be very chunky and catchy guitar riffs laid across the track. This seems it also has some kind of double entendres, like if you step out of line, I'll go on your throat, and other examples like that. In fact, just around the end of the song, there's a little bit of a ELO-esque vocoder bit that is done by, funny enough, of all people, James Newton Howard, who many of you would know as film composer for movies such as Pretty Woman, Atlantis the Lost Empire, Peter Jackson's King Kong remake, The Dark Knight, Fantastic Beasts, just to name a few. He's up there with Hans Zimmer as just one of the top blockbuster film score composers. And it's really funny how he kind of started off with stuff like this. In fact, James kind of does most of the synthesizers for a good chunk of the album. But hey, he's not the only one. Hans Zimmer also appeared in the music video of Buggles' Video Kill the Radio Star. Make of that what it's worth. After the somewhat dramatic sound of Heart in the Right Place, we then go to the more lightheartedness of Just Like Belgium. A more, as I say, more lighter, somewhat slightly more catchier piece from Elton that's also kind of more reminiscent of his heyday work. It also kind of reminds me a bit. The style also kind of reminds me a bit of Road to El Dorado, in particular with the Spanish guitar and whatnot. The lyrics are also kind of have that kind of nostalgic feel, being about a couple spending a nice holiday in Belgium. And while I haven't exactly been to the country myself, and it's probably unlikely I'll probably take a trip there, what with what going on, I can only imagine what Elton sings here actually kind of describes what Belgium is quite like. The song in question is co-written while the previous two songs were co-written by Gary Osborne, who was a prominent writer for Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds. This song was co-written by Bernie Taupin, who, as many would know, has been a great contributor to Elton John. He's been his kind of like songwriting partner. While Elton has written a good chunk of music, it was Bernie who wrote a good chunk of the lyrics. And you do kind of get that kind of quirkiness from Bernie's style, and it's just nice seeing them compose music together as always. Next we have Nobody Wins, a more synth pop kind of track, bit reminiscent of the Human League, that goes into how fragile love and romance and relationships are and can be. This is also probably the only song of the album to not exactly be written or co-written by Elton John, instead being co-written by Gary Osborne and Jean-Paul Frau. I'm probably butchering that name, being French and all. Furthermore, it kind of emphasizes both the innocence of love, in particular young love, and kind of, in a way, compares it to a game or a test, and how inevitably, no matter what may come, no matter what may go, as the title says, nobody will win. The only way to win is to not play. It just kind of goes to show how relationships can even when they're so easily formed or taking effort to be established, they can still easily fall apart because of anything. Anything can cause a relationship to fall apart. And in some way, this song kind of sounds like a potential song for Miguel and Tulio shipping. I don't know why, just kind of thought it. After that, we have Fascist Faces, another one written by the classic duo of Elton and Bernie. And as you can imagine from the title, this one seems more of a satirical, political kind of song, and kind of dressing from their point of view, kind of poking fun at at politicians and kind of higher up people, and just and how they rather seek recognition and fame rather than actually doing something of importance to care for the countries and people that they run. And particularly being a song from 1981, I think part of it kind of refers to Margaret Thatcher having what with it having been kind of the first few years of her time as Prime Minister of the UK. Though, given nowadays, whenever I think of a fascist face, I somehow can't help but think of Joe Biden. But aside from that, it's still a very catchy, almost gospel-esque kind of track, with some self-aware lines like, "When you're Tuttlesque, I'm a hair's breadth," and if the boy had been blessed, he'd have been arrested for on the charge of wearing red shoes. It's still another catchy song that I think should have been a big single, even with a somewhat kind of itchy title like that. Side 2 begins with Carla / etude. Etude being the French word for study. This is the only song of the album to be entirely written by John himself. And blimey, his talent, I underestimate his talent before this point. If I didn't know any better, I could have sworn this was more composed by James Newton Howard, especially later in his heyday, because this is a beautiful collage of piano and orchestra, all the woodwinds, brass and strings coming into a euphoric piece that shifts through emotions within like 4 3/4 minutes. It goes from sorrowful to uncertain to whimsical to hopeful, all within just like 4.5 minutes, which I gotta say is impressive. And it kind of makes me wonder, why doesn't Elton John compose movie scores more often? Stuff like this has shown that he can do good composing and songwriting, and I'd like to see what kind of films he would compose a full-on score to. He's done songs for movies before. You think of Lion King, The Road to El Dorado, and even Romeo and Juliet. So before he retires, I want to see him compose a legit film score. I really want to see him do that. Speaking of Newton Howard, it then transitions very well, I might add, to a very short 1.5-minute synth piece simply called Fanfare, credited to both James Newton Howard and Elton John. And it's a pretty cute and very cute short piece that kind of carries on the kind of emotional vibe that the previous track had, while all the while kind of compressing it into a more minimalist, more simpler sound and approach. It does kind of feel like something that a film composer would do in the earlier heydays before moving on to big, legit, bombastic film score. It still impresses me how it's stuff like this where a great composer like Newton Howard kind of started from. And I don't know what else to say about it other than it's a very cute and short piece that kind of demonstrates the best of both musicians and songwriters. Then the end of that fanfare transitions itself into the next song, Chloe, which is presumably the last piece of what seems to be a somewhat loose suite that still has a connection from one way to another. This one's also co-written between Elton John and John Osborne. And lyrically, it kind of goes and talks about this this romantic interest named Chloe, who who is who is always kind of forgiving, always understanding, no matter how much the singer kind of deceives her intentionally or accidentally, or kind of does something bad. She's always looking out for the good of him. So in a way, whichever or whoever Chloe this song's talking about, it's not exactly Chloe Bourgeois. Musically though, we do get to hear the return of the orchestra from the Carla slash etude piece, although taking more into the background instead of taking the actual spotlight this time around. And it also kind of reminds me a bit of Tiny Dancer, albeit much bit more kind of not as uplifting as Tiny Dancer, but still has that kind of somewhat grandiose, like soft rock kind of feel. After that, we liven things up a bit with Heels of the Wind. This was another kind of classic sound of Elton John. Very jaunty, very piano heavy, and just all around light and kind of fun. This is also another one of the more few optimistic songs of the album, just like Belgium and maybe Breaking Down Barriers. And like Breaking Down Barriers, it kind of acts as a kind of precursor to I'm Still Standing, both lyrically and musically. Despite its somewhat very light-hearted music, and even with a bit of a guitar solo, kind of that reminds me a bit of Echo Beach, the lyrics kind of have a kind of discord to them. What with lines like "just like a broken marriage," "when two people just don't care," and "how can I get so disturbing when two ships pass in the storm." It kind of addresses a lot of negative, potentially dangerous stuff that can happen in life. Yet Elton kind of sings about how no matter what happens, he'll just keep pushing on forward. He'll face his obstacles and just carry on, just a kick away from the heels of the winds, as he said. And in a way, it also kind of goes into his conflict and his sexuality, as if to say, hey, I know bad things are gonna happen to me. It happens to everyone else, and whenever it does happen to me, I'll just kick through it and I'll carry on with my life. I'll carry on doing what I want to do, doing what I do best. And I like songs like that from him. Songs that kind of encourage its listeners, kind of ones that kind of tells readers that life may kick you down, but you can always get back up. That's kind of a good kind of song. I kind of wish this was another memorable single, which is a shame that it never was. Speaking of sexuality, we then come to the one most people, hardcore Elton John fans, like myself especially, mostly know of this album, simply called Eltons Song. And what makes this so kind of remembered by some of us is the content of this particular song, or rather a ballad, as I would put it. Basically, Elton himself said that this was the first gay song he ever wrote, and kind of listening to it, I kind of see where he's coming from. This was pretty much a big risk for him even back in 1981, or whenever this was written or recorded. There hasn't been that much of songs that were explicitly or implicitly about a relationship, a kind of LGBT relationship. And I got over him to taking such a risk and helping it and hope that it kind of helped him to eventually coming out as, well, gay. basically, the song itself is essentially just kind of, it's basically a tragic ballad about how he has this unrequited, in his childhood he had kind of an unrequited love for like a fellow student or a fellow athlete at school or college or something. And the music definitely helps complement that kind of sorrowful mourning feel, with both the orchestra, the piano, and the synth all coming together in this soothing yet very tragic piece of music. And I do recommend. I think a lot of people in the LGBT community can definitely relate to a song like this. I definitely recommend it. We then come to the last song of the album, the titular song, The Fox. This was more of a bluesy, still somewhat uplifting closer to the album, speaking kind of a narrative about the titular fox and how no matter what hunters and traps may come after him, he'd always find a sly way to sneak through, and and kind of and no matter what, the hunter and the fox run through the savage roller gauntlet, dive through the holes, and kind of occasionally speaking from the point of view of the fox, in a way. And from that, it kind of wonders if it's meant to be about a literal fox, or is it kind of meant to be a metaphor as someone comparing themselves and their obstacles and people around them to a fox and hunters and whatnot. I think it's some way that kind of ties into kind of what a good chunk of the themes of this album have been, particularly about facing obstacles and confronting them and kind of breaking down barriers, coming out as gay, and kind of kicking the heels of the wind. And I think this is a good send off to a lot of the thematic elements of most of the songs, if not the overall album. And considering this came out roughly around the same time, almost closely around the Disney film The Fox and the Hound, have things been timed just right? I wonder if Elton could have kind of wrote this song, have if Disney would have used this song for that film. And after all, this would have been well before Elton would eventually write songs for The Lion King. So I kind of want to, probably just a coincidence, but I still think that alone could be an interesting connection. But anyways, Elton John's The Fox is, it may sound like a standard album from Elton, but I still think any album is worth give as much love, appreciation, and in a way, it's still underrated. And I think this was one where I think Elton really tried to face what he could truly be, what he could truly do, what he could be capable of, especially having coming out with, well, Elton's Song. And if it weren't for this album, I don't think he'd probably get a better chance. And I think it's probably thanks to this that we will eventually get eventually get bigger hits such as Too Low for Zero, which has, guess why they call it a blues, and of course I'm Still Standing. So I think we kind of owe it to albums like this to go on. And if you're a fan of Elton John, or you just want to get into his music, or want to listen to his more lesser known stuff, I gladly recommend this album. If you can find this LP at a cardboard sale or shop, or even on CD, or if it's streaming on Spotify or something, go ahead and stream it, buy it, and listen to it, and appreciate what Elton John can do and what he can be. Next time, we return to looking at another Genesis album, and one from the 1980s. One coincidentally released close around the same time as their former singer Jimmy Gabriel's So, at a time when Genesis had a touch, an invisible touch. So, this is what the story watcher, or rather, a piece of him, has resorted his life to. Well, no matter. He and his friends are about to be in for a little surprise of what I and my masters have in store for him.